Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is really to cut through the noise, look hard at the sources, and pull out some key lessons from some really formidable figures in history.
Formidable and, let's be honest, often incredibly aggressive individuals.
Exactly. We're tackling a question that seems to define capitalism across centuries. Where do you draw the line between, relentless ambition and just ruthless, maybe unethical conduct?
And that boundary, that friction point, it's something we saw running through all the source material we dug into. We've meticulously traced the patterns, the philosophies of these titans, right, from the Gilded Age industrialists all the way through to, well, today's Silicon Valley architects.
Yeah.
And what you see is that the line, it often feels like a strategic choice for them. It's not usually an accident crossing that line.
So our focus here is that win at all costs mentality. How does it actually work? What does it look like? We're examining control, pure aggression, and the often toxic internal cultures these leaders seem to create.
Right.
So you, the listener, by the end of this, should really get the mechanics of how these empires got built and understand why total victory was, for these founders, the absolute non-negotiable goal.
We'll be unpacking case studies from oil barons, railroad tycoons, jumping into the strategies of modern tech giants, think Microsoft, Amazon, and then diving into that dizzying speed and, frankly, the ethical gray zones or maybe voids in modern finance.
So the core question underpinning this whole deep dive is pretty crucial, isn't it?
It really is. What does success even look like when integrity is just deliberately pushed aside, treated as secondary, maybe even irrelevant?
And how does that singular drive, that need for absolute domination, play out across fields as different as, say, transportation, software code, and financial derivatives? It seems to be everywhere.
It does. So let's unpack this huge history of aggression. And maybe the best place to start is where it all began, with establishing total control.
Okay, so if you look back at those 19th century giants, their success really seemed to hinge on this simple, maybe brutal idea. Establish total control. Full stop.
Yeah, they used hyper-aggressive tactics, often ruthless ones, not just to compete, but really to crush rivals or absorb them.
They kind of set this foundational belief, didn't they, that competition isn't something you tolerate, it's something you eliminate.
Exactly. And maybe the master of using the corporation itself as a weapon was Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Ah, the Commodore.
Right. He didn't just use the corporate structure for business logistics. He weaponized it for personal campaigns. The sources lay it out pretty clearly how he went after this foe, a guy named White.
Right, I remember this.
Vanderbilt launched what was basically a full-scale assault on the share price of Accessory Transit. And it was calculated because most of White's wealth was tied up right there in those shares.
So he wasn't just trying to hurt the company. He was trying to impoverish White personally.
Precisely. He even publicly declared the stock worthless as long as his enemies stayed involved. This wasn't just, shrewd business. It was economic destruction driven by pure vendetta.
That's an incredible level of blending personal feuds with corporate strategy. And he could do it because he operated on a scale that just dwarfed everyone else.
Absolutely. To get a sense of his power, just look at that transaction with Robert Seiler. The sources show Vanderbilt loaning Schuyler this staggering sum, $600,000, in 1 month, October, and taking thousands of shares as collateral.
$600,000 back then? I mean, what does that even mean in terms of weight?
Well, think about it this way. At that time, if a really successful merchant died and his entire estate was worth $600,000, he'd be considered exceptionally wealthy. A titan.
Okay.
And Vanderbilt's just loaning that amount out in a single short-term deal. He was playing in a completely different financial league. The rules didn't really apply to him in the same way. And that huge resource pool made his financial attacks incredibly effective.
And it wasn't just external enemies he was aggressive towards. He demanded absolute authority inside his own companies, too.
Oh yeah, total focus on centralization. After he displaced the Hudson River Railroad Board in a disputed election, which was kind of his signature move,
Right.
he immediately set up a standing executive committee, which was basically just him making decisions through them. And their first big move, eliminate internal competition between his own 2 major lines, the Hudson River and the Harlem trains.
So even competition within his own empire was unacceptable.
Completely intolerable. Any friction, internal or external, had to go. He believed command had to be singular, absolute.
Okay, so Vanderbilt's method was, let's say, physical control of transit and financial demolition. What about John D. Rockefeller Sr.? He mastered the supply chain with this calculated, almost terrifying efficiency.
Rockefeller's ability for what the sources call extraordinary ferocity in getting competitors to submit is legendary. But it was always methodical, very calculated. He didn't usually rely on just brute force. He preferred suffocation.
Suffocation. How so?
Well, for instance, he'd starve out rival firms. Not by attacking their refineries directly, but by quietly buying up all the available barrels they needed to ship their oil. Or he'd monopolize the local tank cars.
Ah, so you could make the oil, but you couldn't move it. You were paralyzed.
Exactly. If you can't package your product, if you can't transport it, your whole operation just grinds to a halt. You're left with basically one choice: sell out to Standard Oil, often for pennies on the dollar, or face certain bankruptcy.
But the sources also suggest that while he could unleash this kind of terror, his preference was actually to seduce rivals into cooperating rather than just ruining them.
That's a really crucial distinction in his approach. Standard Oil wasn't just about destroying companies. It was about assembling this massive, cohesive empire.
Right.
So he'd frequently buy out rivals, yeah. But then, to ensure what the sources call intra-empire harmony, he'd often keep the original management on the payroll, even if they were redundant or not very good.
Accumulating expensive deadwood, as the sources put it.
Exactly that phrase. His goal was peaceful, total submission. A unified front was better than constant internal fighting, even if it cost a bit more upfront.
What's really fascinating, though, is how deeply he seemed to justify all this internally. He really seemed to believe he was doing a public good by building this monopoly.
Yeah, there seems to have been this profound, almost psychological need for him to rationalize his actions. He gave this long defense of trusts, arguing Standard Oil was beloved because, well, it brought cheap, reliable light to the world with the cheapest and best petroleum.
But the sources are pretty skeptical of that self-assessment.
They are. They note he was often voluble rather than candid, meaning he could talk your ear off, but he wasn't capable of real self-criticism. When asked about Standard Oil's huge dividends, his response was just to sort of lift his eyes heavenward and express gratitude for the profits. Zero acknowledgement of the human cost, the anti-competitive practices that generated that wealth. No regrets voiced, ever.
Okay. Moving from oil to steel. Andrew Carnegie had a slightly different take on ruthless efficiency, especially when it came to labor.
Carnegie's approach was very transactional. He viewed human capital almost like raw materials. His philosophy was pay the highest wages, but not out of kindness, strictly to get the best men.
Right. Labor is a commodity like anything else, I think he said.
That's the quote. He believed this system paid for itself because you ended up with fewer men do your work and you were getting honest, respectable, sober men. It was, ruthlessness framed as industrial optimization.
And this kind of high-pressure transactional environment, it naturally led to some serious internal friction, right? Most famously with Henry Clay Frick, especially around the Homestead strike.
Oh, definitely. That clash between them really shows the personal nature of control in these empires. Carnegie, who was often physically distant from the day-to-day operations, accused Frick of trying to steal the limelight.
While Frick, the guy on the ground, felt undermined.
Constantly. Frick was the junior partner, but he knew way more about the practical side of steel and coke. Yet Carnegie held the majority shares and wielded that power. Frick felt Carnegie was making suggestions from afar without understanding the reality.
And Frick's aggressive actions at Homestead, bringing in the Pinkertons and Scabs, he defended those as basically necessary survival tactics, right?
Sure.
Especially against Carnegie's sort of implied criticism.
Exactly. Frick argued that if they'd waited or shown weakness, they'd have eventually been forced to try and starve our men into submission anyway, which would have been a longer, maybe even uglier conflict. And when Carnegie responded rather condescendingly, saying something like, "Suggestions of a change do not imply personal reflections," Frick just bristled. It really highlights how these empires weren't built on smooth teamwork. They're often forged in these intense internal power struggles, driven by clashing styles of command and control.
Right. And our last figure from this era, Henry Ford, he kind of embodied a different kind of ruthlessness, this stubborn independence, resisting any outside influence.
Yeah, Ford's core thing was follow my own instincts, maintain total independence. He resisted attempts by wealthy elites to steer his course. And this single-minded focus, well, it led to world-changing disruption. Think about the assembly line.
Right. The sources point out that the assembly line wasn't some grand vision initially. It was forced on them because they were making parts faster than they could actually assemble the cars.
The pressure was internal, it was overwhelming. Necessity was the mother of invention there. And that necessity drove incredible efficiency gains. Engine assembly time just plummeted from nearly 600 man-minutes down to, 226?
Oh,
It wasn't gradual improvement, it was disruptive acceleration, demanded by Ford's relentless push for maximum output.
but the sources also connect this rugged independence to a more destructive personality trait.
Yeah, his absolute faith in his own instincts had a downside, a big one. It led to this sort of paranoid view of the world of social dynamics. Ford tended to blame problems on external forces, enemies, conspiracies, rather than looking critically at his own system or the market. He was this force for, democratic opportunity in some ways, making cars affordable, but his anti-intellectualism and paranoia meant he was often intellectually isolated, seeing the world as this constant battle against perceived threats.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork with the Gilded Age tycoons, control, aggression, eliminating rivals. If they conquered physical resources and geography, the modern tech titans seem to conquer code, attention, and maybe time itself.
Right. And here, that relentless drive for control looks a bit different. It manifests as, rapid technical acceleration, extreme demands on workers, and this almost fanatical focus on the product.
Let's start with the early software wars. That competitive mindset really defined by Bill Gates.
Gates's view was famously explicit: business is war, simple as that. And he fought that war relentlessly on every single front. He used aggressive pricing, like undercutting rivals, even smaller ones like Teammaker, which was only an $8 million company at the time.
No target too small.
Exactly. For Gates, every piece of the market mattered. He was always engaged, always pushing.
And his most powerful weapon was leveraging control of the operating system, right? DOS and then Windows.
Absolutely. That gave him immense structural power. The sources detail how he'd pressure OEMs, the computer manufacturers like DEC. He'd essentially say, look, if you want Microsoft Word, you have to at least offer them MS-DOS as an option on your machines.
That kind of bundling, that leverage.
It was incredibly potent, so much so that critics like Pete Peterson had that famous line about Microsoft being the fox that takes you across the river and then eats you.
Right. Implying they offer help, but only to get themselves into a position where they dominate you later.
Precisely. It's all about leveraging one product's dominance to gain control in another market.
Now let's contrast Gates' approach market share through leverage with Steve Jobs. His primary drive seemed to be this obsession with end-to-end control.
Yeah, totally different focus. Where Gates wanted share, Jobs wanted perfection through vertical integration. He needed to control the hardware, the OS, the software, the whole experience.
A controlled environment, as he put it.
That was non-negotiable for him, and that's why he was just, congenitally averse to licensing the Macintosh OS.
Even if licensing could have made the Mac the industry standard, like the IBM PC became.
Even then, it's amazing, really. His own marketing director actually proposed licensing the OS to companies like Tandy, which would have been huge for market penetration.
Wow.
Jobs shot it down. He preferred to sacrifice the Mac's chance to be the standard rather than give up one iota of control over the quality and the user experience. For him, the control was the product, in a way.
And enforcing that standard of absolute control came with a notoriously tyrannical leadership style.
Oh, it was temperamental, often incredibly harsh, and deeply rooted in his personality, apparently going way back to his early days at Atari.
Right.
At Apple, he became, as the sources say, increasingly tyrannical and sharp in his criticism. He'd apparently walk up to young programmers and just say, that design looks like shit. And the sources point out, sometimes he'd say this without even fully understanding the technical work they were doing. It created this environment of intense, sometimes arbitrary, very personal pressure that just defined the internal culture.
Okay, turning to maybe the newest generation of these titans, Elon Musk seems to encapsulate that relentless engineering focus, but it's coupled with this instability, this absolute, maybe impulsive control.
His situation after buying Twitter, now X, it's a perfect illustration of that contradiction, isn't it? He stated these two opposing goals right out of the gate.
Right. More free speech, but also keep advertisers happy.
Exactly. Open the platform to more raucous free speech, but simultaneously avoid creating a free-for-all hellscape that would terrify advertisers. And, those two goals were fundamentally at odds.
And the fallout from that contradiction was almost immediate and very public.
Yeah, his own actions didn't help. Tweeting things like the Paul Pelosi conspiracy theory directly undermined his pledge to stabilize the platform. It just showcased the spread of what the sources call weaponized disinformation.
And the cost was real and fast.
Incredibly steep. Advertising revenue, which was like 90% of Twitter's income, was already shaky. But after his takeover, it just plummeted down by more than half in only 6 months. It really shows the devastating financial impact of unchecked, centralized impulse in today's digital economy.
Yet you can't deny his genius for that relentless, hands-on, engineering-focused micromanagement.
No, that mechanical obsession is undeniable. You see it in that famous anecdote about the assembly line. Musk is on the factory floor. He spots these robotic arms tightening bolts, and he just thinks they're moving way too slowly.
Right.
He insists they check the settings. Eventually, they have to find a technician who knows how to access the control console, and sure enough, the robot's only set to like 20% of its maximum speed.
Wow, so nobody knew how to speed it up.
Yeah. Apparently not, or hadn't thought to. It reveals this kind of culture where the CEO has to dive into the absolute most granular mechanical detail because maybe the institutional knowledge or initiative to optimize the system just wasn't there otherwise. His demands are often seen as crazy, but sometimes maybe they're necessary to break through that organizational inertia.
Okay, finally in this section, let's look at Jeff Bezos, often described by people inside Amazon as this potent strategic mix of missionary and mercenary.
That dual nature really feels like Amazon's engine. The missionary part is the big vision, right? Customer obsession, thinking long-term, changing the world.
And the mercenary.
That's the ruthless, often totally uncompromising execution required to actually achieve that grand vision. In Amazon's early days, those frantic holiday seasons, the pressure to deliver was apparently so intense that executives had to resort to what the sources call artifice and improvisation. They just didn't have the selection yet. But they had to look like they did to meet Bezos's relentless expectations.
And when that missionary vision hit roadblocks, say from the market, the mercenary side would emerge, turning Amazon into a bogeyman, as one source put it.
Yeah, that seems like a necessary part of their dominance strategy. When Amazon needed book publishers to digitize their catalogs quickly, they started nicely with inducements.
Okay.
But when that didn't work fast enough, they shifted immediately to threats. Publishers were basically warned, if you don't comply, you risk losing prominence in Amazon's search results, which was, even then, becoming vital.
So Bezos deliberately used Amazon's growing power as leverage.
Calculated leverage. He forced Amazon to become the market's bogeyman to achieve his goals for digitization and ultimately dominance.
And this absolute demand for control even caused an internal crisis when a top executive, Joe Galli, apparently challenged his authority.
Yeah, the sources recount that story. Galli seemed to think he'd been hired to essentially run the company day to day, but Bezos kept his hand firmly on the steering wheel, having strong opinions on everything from tiny homepage tweaks to major acquisition strategies.
So conflict was inevitable.
Pretty much. Bezos just wouldn't yield control. Galli was eventually pushed out, and while the board apparently agreed Galli was being disruptive, the whole episode really underscores Bezos's absolute unwavering commitment to being the single person in charge of the company's direction. No subordinate, no matter how talented, was going to take the wheel.
Okay, so that culture of winning at all costs, it transitions almost seamlessly into the world of high finance, doesn't it? Where the battles are fought with, derivatives, algorithms, complex capital structures.
Absolutely. And here, speed, opacity, secrecy, and, well, ethical compromises become not just side effects, but essential tools for generating massive profits.
We almost have to start with the raw aggression of the leverage buyout, the LBO era, epitomized by that legendary battle for RGR Nabisco.
Oh, yeah. The RJR and Nabisco fight in the late 80s, that was like the ultimate showcase of this new brutal logic and merger work when the company's own management tried to buy it out.
KKR just swooped in.
KKR decided to, as the book famously put it, crash Johnson's party. They completely bypassed management, went straight to the shareholders with a higher offer, $90 per share, a tender offer.
And the money fueling this was immense.
Unbelievable amounts. The sheer volume of institutional cash pouring into LBO funds back then, something like $25 billion in 1988 alone, which could theoretically acquire $250 billion worth of companies. It just created this irresistible pressure for these hostile, aggressive raids.
And the goal wasn't really about building a better company long term, was it? It was financial restructuring for immediate, often massive profit. And appearances were crucial.
Absolutely critical. For the management team trying to buy their own company, like Johnson and Robinson at RJR, the priority wasn't necessarily operational reality, it was public perception. They relied heavily on cosmetics, as the sources say, to make their management buyout bid look good to a very skeptical public and, crucially, to the board.
So questions about whether employees would actually benefit from Johnson's promised riches. That was secondary.
It seemed secondary to getting the deal approved. They needed the narrative to be palatable, even if the underlying structure was maybe shaky or overly focused on enriching the top players. It was a deal sold on story, not always on substance.
In this kind of high-stakes environment, it naturally bred a culture where legal lines were constantly being pushed, maybe crossed, leading to the rise of systemic insider trading concerns.
Yeah, you look at figures like Steve Cohen. During one period of intense market chaos, he apparently lost almost half his capital, which is staggering.
Right.
But what defined his success wasn't avoiding the loss, it was his reaction to it. The sources describe him as having an almost inhuman ability to stay calm and make rational trading decisions right in the middle of the panic.
He saw chaos as opportunity.
Exactly. And he immediately used it to consolidate power. He basically told his nearly wiped out traders, okay, from now on, I'm the only trader here, and you guys are my clerks.
Wow. That's ultimate control right there. And yet, despite years of investigations and lots of smoke suggesting potential insider trading around his firm, actually prosecuting Cohen criminally proved incredibly hard.
It really illustrates how sophisticated the financial shield can be. Investigators spent, a decade trying to build a solid criminal case against Cohen himself. But they never got the conviction they were aiming for.
Why is it so hard?
Well, the architecture of high finances, the layers of shell companies, the complexity of the transactions, the legal loopholes, it often seems specifically designed to protect these aggressive, high-value actors from clear criminal liability. Even if the surrounding circumstances strongly suggest consistent ethical issues or rules being bent.
Okay, shifting focus slightly within finance. Modern financial aggression is maybe defined less by hostile takeovers and more by pure speed, epitomized by the high-frequency trading, or HFT, arms race.
The quest for microseconds in HFT is just astonishing, both in its absurdity and the sheer commitment involved. You have traders willing to pay enormous sums of money just to physically move their computer servers a few feet closer to the main data exit pipe, say, in that big data center in Nutley, New Jersey.
Just for a tiny edge in transmission time.
A microscopic edge, and there's an even more granular example in the sources.
Yeah.
Another trader realized the fiber optic cable running to their server inside the data center wasn't perfectly straight. It had a slight bend, making it maybe a few yards longer than theoretically necessary.
Oh, come on.
Seriously, they demanded it be rerouted in a perfect straight line across the room just to shave off those final crucial nanoseconds. It shows the battle isn't even intellectual or purely financial anymore. It's become almost purely infrastructural, down to the physical layout of cables.
And the people actually building these lightning-fast systems, did they feel connected to the ethical implications of the massive profits being generated?
Often, not really. Take the programmer Serge Alienated, who built high-speed trading systems for Goldman Sachs. He described his own feeling as being like a getaway driver.
A getaway driver.
Yeah. Essential for the operation, the crime, metaphorically speaking, but totally detached from its purpose or morality. When asked if he cared how the firm made hundreds of millions of dollars using his code, he admitted, not really. It's all one big gamble, one way or another.
Yeah.
He apparently knew very little about the actual trading business, just as little as the firm allowed him to know, which highlights how Wall Street often wanted to minimize the intellectual influence of the coders they relied on, keep them as technicians, siloed from the bigger picture, maybe keeping the whole thing morally opaque.
And this lack of transparency, this opacity, wasn't just limited to individual traders or programmers. It became systemic, didn't it? Leading to huge scandals like the LIBOR manipulation and the rise of Wall Street's dark pools.
Dark pools are a perfect example of the dangers of institutional opacity. By design, their trading rules weren't published. An outsider, even a client trading within them, couldn't see the full picture of what was happening inside.
So what were the risks?
Well, the sources explicitly note that because of this secrecy, it was entirely possible that a broker's own traders were trading against the customers within those same dark pools, exploiting information advantages, leading to schemes like dark pool arbitrage. This wasn't just rogue traders, it was potentially structural manipulation built right into the system.
And in the LIBOR scandal, The manipulation of that key interest rate became so widespread, it was almost normalized. Expected, even.
It seems that way. There's an anecdote about a Morgan Stanley trader who suspected rates were being manipulated. When he brought it up, he was apparently laughed at for being naive.
Laughed at.
Yeah. He was told it was just common knowledge that banks tweaked LIBOR to benefit their own massive trading positions that depended on the rate. It shows how normalized illicit behavior can become when the culture is purely focused on the whim. Manipulation just gets seen as, well, standard operating procedure.
And crucially, when one of the LIBOR defendants, Tom Hayes, went on trial, he actually used that normalization as his central defense strategy.
He did. His defense basically argued that because lots of people are doing it, the behavior couldn't be considered fundamentally dishonest. It was just how the game was played.
How did the prosecution respond to that?
They shut it down hard. The prosecution explicitly dismissed that claim, comparing it to arguing that burglary is okay if someone happened to leave a window open. Thankfully, the law didn't accept the cynical idea that just because unethical behavior becomes widespread within a culture, it somehow stops being fundamentally dishonest.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time detailing how these aggressive empires were built. But there's a second half to this story, isn't there? The often devastating internal liability that this kind of aggressive ethos creates.
Absolutely. That win-at-all-costs culture, it doesn't just harm competitors or the market. It corrodes the company from within, it damages relationships, breeds dysfunction, and often leads to pretty spectacular corporate or personal setbacks.
And maybe there's no more disturbing recent example of that cultural cost than the systemic deception we saw at Purdue Pharma involving the Sackler family and OxyContin.
Yeah, that case really reveals how deeply aggression can metastasize into a corporate culture, with tragic results. After Purdue reformulated OxyContin to make it supposedly tamper-resistant, their own staff immediately recognized this massive ethical and practical contradiction they had to manage.
What was the contradiction?
Well, they were publicly boasting about the safety features of their new reformulated drug, but at the same time, a related company they controlled, Rhodes Pharma, was still churning out non-tamper-resistant immediate-release oxycodone, the original kind that was easier to abuse.
Wow. So they had to actively work to hide the fact that they were profiting from both sides, from the safer version and the less safe version they claimed to be solving.
Precisely. The sources show Purdue staff knew they needed to operate in a secretive manner to obfuscate this reality. The goal seemed to be maximizing profit across both forms of the drug while carefully managing the public narrative about safety and responsibility.
And the real-world consequences of this corporate deception were just catastrophic, especially in vulnerable communities.
The human toll is staggering. The sources confirm it. In Massachusetts alone, investigators were able to confirm that 671 people died from opioid-related overdoses over a decade after having filled prescriptions for Purdue's painkillers.
671 deaths just in that one state linked to their prescriptions.
Yeah, and this just starkly contradicted the company's repeated public claims that iatrogenic addiction, meaning addiction caused by a legitimate doctor's prescription, was practically unheard of. The cost of their aggressive, profit-maximizing culture was measured in hundreds, thousands of lives and helped fuel a national crisis.
Beyond calculated deception like Purdue's, we also often see how unchecked genius, or perceived genius, can breed this real arrogance of command, which then leads to deep internal dysfunction. Howard Hughes Aircraft is a fascinating historical example.
Hughes was undeniably a brilliant engineer, right? A visionary in many ways. But his leadership style, or maybe lack thereof in some areas, created huge organizational problems. The internal structure was apparently chaotic.
How so?
Well, the sources mention the payroll being padded up with ex-Hollywood people who literally never showed up for work. The actual function of many employees was totally unclear. And maybe worse, the essential departments engineering and production were described as being barely on speaking terms.
So despite having a genius at the top, the company itself was dysfunctional.
Profoundly so, it seems. The internal cultural dysfunction meant the company struggled to operate cohesively despite Hughes's brilliance. Genius isn't enough if the organization is falling apart.
And we see echoes of that kind of expected deference, that arrogance, even in maybe quieter, more ritualistic behaviors from financial titans, like Blackstone's Peter G. Peterson.
Yeah, Peterson was often described by colleagues as aloof, imperious, and even pompous around the office. And this wasn't just his attitude. It was expressed in these small but powerful symbolic actions.
Like what?
Like Apparently, he had this habit of just tossing his scribbled notes over his shoulder,
Without looking.
expecting aides, secretaries, sometimes even his own partners to literally bend down, gather them up off the floor for his later use.
Wow.
It's a small thing, but it perfectly symbolizes that expectation of total deference, almost servitude. It demonstrated that his authority required everyone around him to be subordinate, even in their physical posture.
This whole issue of internal culture, it also brings up the loss of authenticity, doesn't it? That gap between a carefully crafted public image and the maybe harsher private reality. Oprah Winfrey provides a really potent example here.
Yeah, her on-camera persona was just defined by warmth, empathy, connection. But off-air, according to some guests cited in the sources, she could be very different. Shut down, aloof, a bit standoffish.
Mm.
One author observed that this disconnect often left guests feeling, well, diminished and maybe used because they came expecting the warm, accessible Oprah they saw on TV.
And the theory was she saved it all for the camera.
That was the observation, yeah. That she gave her emotion all to the camera, so there's very little left over for the more private, personal interactions. It was like a calculated performance, an expenditure of charisma for the brand.
And that need for control, it extended to managing her public narrative too, didn't it? Especially fighting back against the tabloids.
Absolutely. She was very aware that her core audience was also the audience reading the tabloids. So, to protect her brand, she made this strategic decision to preemptively manage a really sensitive personal topic, past drug abuse.
How did she do that?
Crucially, the show discussing it would be pre-taped, not live. This allowed her and her team to edit it carefully, ensuring maximum impact and, importantly, narrative control. She could allude generally to her past use, but frame it entirely on her own terms, taking control of the story before the tabloids could define it for her. It was a very strategic, self-protective move by someone hyper-aware of image and brand security.
Okay, and finally we see this culture of maybe paranoia, or at least hypervigilance, even after huge wins in the tech world. Mark Zuckerberg is the key example here.
Yeah, even after Facebook made that massive acquisition of Instagram a huge success by any measure, Zuckerberg's fear of being displaced, of losing market dominance, was apparently intense.
So what did he do?
He immediately started searching for other potential Instagrams out there to buy. He saw the Instagram purchase not as a final victory, but merely as one move in a larger defensive strategy, a way to hedge against Facebook's inevitable fade, as the source puts it.
That doesn't sound like a confident victor.
It sounds more like a paranoid chess player, right? Constantly anticipating threats, constantly buying insurance against future disruption, even after landing a major blow.
Which brings us, I think, to a really crucial lesson about the inherent dangers of holding too much power for too long. A lesson that Disney's former CEO, Robert Iger, reflected on.
Iger's reflection is really insightful. Looking back on his long tenure, he realized maybe it's not always good for one person to have too much power for too long.
Why not?
He noted how easily a leader's confidence, which is necessary, can tip over into arrogance, into overconfidence, and actually become a liability. A long-serving CEO can become impatient, dismissive of others' opinions, simply because they stop being challenged effectively.
So the command structure itself can become self-destructive.
It can decay from within. And Iger realized he had to fight this consciously. He actually told his closest executives explicitly, look, if you notice me being too dismissive or impatient, you need to tell me.
Wow.
It's this recognition that the very culture of command, the thing that drove success, can eventually undermine itself without explicit, conscious safeguards. And often those safeguards have to be put in place by the leader themselves. Hashtag outro.
So we've really charted the methods here, haven't we? Covering this whole spectrum from Vanderbilt's financial warfare and Rockefeller's suffocating supply chain tactics.
Right, through to Gates's aggressive software licensing, and then into the blinding speed, and frankly, the systemic opacity we see in modern finance.
The core takeaway seems pretty clear. Whether you're looking at the 19th century industrialists or the 21st century tech and finance giants, achieving that kind of extraordinary success often seems to require, or maybe it just inevitably results in leaders who operate outside conventional ethical lines, or at least push right up against them.
Yeah, they prioritize ruthless control, speed, acceleration, absolute market dominance. And they often justify their methods by pointing to the scale of the success they deliver, whether that's cheap oil back then, or cheap consumer goods from Amazon, or unprecedented financial returns today.
The genius, as we kept seeing, often seems to come paired with, well, tyranny, or at least profound moral ambiguity.
That seems to be the recurring pattern.
And this concept, this pushing boundaries and finding ways to self-justify it, that's carried through centuries of capitalism. But now, the stakes feel like they're rapidly escalating, which leads us to our final, maybe provocative thought for today.
Yeah, the sources we looked at briefly touched upon the burgeoning field of gene editing, specifically CRISPR technology. And the discussion there is already getting complicated, blurring the lines between what we consider treatment, fixing serious genetic diseases
Right.
versus prevention, and then moving into enhancement, maybe making humans stronger, smarter, beyond the current norm. But then they propose this final, even more radical category, super enhancements.
Super enhancements. So, if the grand prize used to be controlling railroads or oil or software, what's the ultimate prize in this emerging era?
Well, super enhancements implies aiming for capabilities maybe previously unknown to our species, things like avoiding aging altogether, or gaining entirely new sensory abilities, the ability to see infrared light maybe, or hear ultra-high frequencies, things like that.
Wow.
So the question becomes, if the whole history of capitalism, as we've discussed, is defined by this relentless, often self-justified aggression, this constant pushing of boundaries, financial, ethical, legal, what limit, if any, will these new titans respect when the ultimate prize isn't just control over a market, but potentially the super enhancement of human nature itself?
What happens when that win at all costs culture meets the human genetic code?
Exactly. That feels like the ultimate question looming as we consider the next great frontier of human ambition and potentially human aggression.
A profound thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.